Experience the most efficient system for delivering sulfur and phosphate to meet your crop's needs with Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST.
Welcome back to Real Ag Radio. I am your host for the day, Lyndsey Smith, and joining me now is Adriane Good. She's a livestock and feed extension specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. Welcome here, Adriane.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, so, it is the season, let's say, when livestock producers are anxiously anticipating the beginning of the winter feeding season. We had a decent year for parts of Saskatchewan, but definitely others way too dry. And so that does bring up the point, could we salvage some grain crops for feed? What do farmers and ranchers need to consider if that's an option?
For sure, yes. We have seen, pretty similar amounts to what we've seen the last few years in salvaging grain crops for feed. There's a few things we need to look for, though. We are not trying to make our livestock sick. We want to make sure we're feeding them what we need to, take our whole feed inventory into balance with these salvage crops. So there's quite a few things to think about.
Right. So let's walk through some of those considerations because, for the most part, grain crops can be fed out, but there are some pretty major implications depending on what you are feeding. So maybe we'll start with, first of all, that a consideration of what the crop was treated with or sprayed with. What do we need to know there?
Yes, for sure. So there are some pesticides, whether those be herbicides or insecticides or other, that cannot be fed to livestock. So if you have sprayed that crop and you weren't intending to feed it to livestock, make sure you check out those grazing restrictions or those feeding restrictions on the herbicide or any pesticide. One that was recently pulled from use for livestock was lambda cyhalothrin. So if you sprayed with that, that cannot be fed to livestock.
That's right. That is one of those great things where it's okay for humans, not approved for livestock use. So keep that in mind. Very important. Now, I would think about also any crop disease. I'm thinking about Urgot especially. Which crops do we really have to be diligent about whether or not we've got Urgot in there?
Really your cereal and grass type crops are going to be your biggest concern. Generally a bigger concern in wet years, wet areas, but I have seen Urgot come into our moose jaw office this year, so we've been pretty dry, so it can come anywhere. So just keep an eye out for those Urgot bodies. We can send them for testing for all those alkaloids and then other toxins from things like fusarium. We can test for all that, so a quick test. It's about $100 to $200 for those tests, but it's cheaper than a dead cow. So
yeah. Especially right now, that is absolutely certain. Okay, so that actually brings up a really good point on feed testing. So just a few weeks on the show talked about, testing your forage supply, really looking at sort of the quality side. But there are other things we should be testing for, but how important is it to take tests of our salvage crops as well?
Yes, so important for salvage crops. I think as long as I've been in extension, I've been saying feed test, feed test, feed test, feed test with everything, but salvage crops especially, we're going to look at some of those fibers, look at some of the minerals. So like brassicas love to accumulate sulfur. High sulfur can even be further exacerbated if you are in an area with high sulfate water. So keep an eye on that. Some crops also like to accumulate high sodium. That can cause a whole bunch of issues. Again, if you have bad water, that can make it worse. And then some of those other things, nitrates. I advise nitrate testing all the time for pretty much anything, but especially salvage crop. If you've fertilized it for grain production, there's a lot of nitrogen there. Pretty high risk for nitrates. And then again, brassicas, they love to accumulate nitrates too. So testing nitrates. And then some of the other things, like prussic acid, it acts like cyanide in the animal. So there is one lab we can send it to test for that. That one's going to be a problem in like flax when it freezes. So it's a little less ubiquitous than nitrates.
I think, it is.
Okay.
Something like a prussic acid issue is definitely more rare, but it certainly can happen.
Yeah, for sure. We've seen animals have issues with prussic acid. So there's a fewer crops that it's a worry for, though.
Mm-hmm. So now, that's actually, these are really good points, is that often if we're salvaging a crop, it's because either there was no yield there, or perhaps it got frozen, or maybe there was a hailstorm. So what do we need to consider, like what situations where nitrates might be more of a problem, or something like a prussic acid? Like when should we keep that on our radar?
Sure, pretty much anytime those plants are stressed, there's going to be, especially with nitrates, drought stress, hail stress, frost stress. Those nitrates are going to accumulate. Prussic acid is frost stress, and we can see some higher stuff in droughty periods too. So any stress, make sure you're checking for some of those compounds.
Mm-hmm. Now, when I think of taking a crop for salvage, I'm often thinking about, I've certainly seen canola being ensiled. I've seen also just crops baled off, even grazed off. Is there a preferred way of potentially salvaging crops as far as how you're going to feed it out, or is it really situational?
It can be situational. Generally, when we're working with producers, we try and figure out what's going to work best on your operation, and we'll figure it out. We do like to kind of limit the amount of salvage crop that they're eating. In an ideal world, we'd like to keep it on the lower end of the ration. But we do also work with people who just want to kick their cows out to graze it. It's risky, but we can do it, and we can feed test and try and minimize the risk out there. So any way you want to do it, we can figure it out.
Right. So to that end of sitting down and trying to figure out what that ration might look like, is the reason of wanting to keep it lower because of some of these issues with a stressed crop? Is that really what it comes down to?
That is, yeah. And some things, well, yeah, it's mostly with the stress crops, some of those nitrates, sulfur issues. If we feed test, we know what we're dealing with, so we can really dial it in well. But just kind of keeping it at the lower end. And some cows are picky, and they just won't eat what you want them to eat. So that helps keep it lower.
Yeah, absolutely. They're not as big as sorters as, say, sheep and goats, but they'll still refuse stuff.
Oh, they will, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely they will. Okay, now a key point here, because certainly, I mean, it's not usually a good news story if we're using salvage crops, but it can be, of course, a great part of making use of something that would otherwise, just be turned under or whatever. Where can producers go if they've got questions or if they want more resources, want to dig into what to consider with salvage crops?
So we have the Agriculture Knowledge Center here in Saskatchewan. You can give us a call at 1-866-457-2377. You're most likely going to talk to one of us livestock and feed extension specialists. There's 10 of us in the province. If you have questions about the pesticides that you're using, we know about the feeding restrictions, but we also have crops extension specialists that can talk you through some of those harder questions that we're not as versed in. So, and there's other specialists for other questions as well.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Adriane, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.